When the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will come to order. We're meeting today to examine Klamath River Basin drought conditions and opportunities for durable solutions to the basin's ecosystem and water supply challenges. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearing are limited to the chair and ranking member or their designees. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and keeps members on schedule. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. And hearing no objection, that is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. And finally, members or witnesses who experience technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes to make opening remarks. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We're today gathering to discuss current drought conditions in the Klamath River Basin and look at opportunities to advance durable solutions for the basin's ecosystem and water supply challenges. For today's hearing, the Klamath Basin is represented not just by today's witnesses, but also by the chair and ranking member of this subcommittee. I'm glad to chair this hearing alongside Cliff Benz, whose district includes Klamath communities upstream from my district. I have the lower end of the system. Since last year, we have seen some of the worst drought conditions in the Klamath Basin in decades. Unfortunately, breaking these kind of records is starting to become a regular occurrence across the West due to climate change. We'll hear today about the effects of these changing climate conditions in the Klamath Basin and the consequences on the ground for tribes, agriculture, fish and wildlife, and fishing communities. Recently, we've seen devastating effects from a lack of water for fish and wildlife, including for in-stream flows and flushing flows to prevent fish disease. Limited flushing flows have contributed to yet another year of rampant fish disease and infection that is killing off tribal fisheries. We'll hear more today from our witnesses about how tribal treaty rights, fishing rights, and water rights are currently not being satisfied. The tribes joining us have lived along the Klamath River and fished the once abundant salmon habitat since time immemorial. The salmon runs are integral to the tribe's traditions and ceremonies, and many tribal families rely on fishing to pay their bills. So let's not diminish or disrespect them by saying this is just about fish. This is about people who deserve better. We must finally and fully honor tribal water rights and fishing rights and work for durable solutions to support healthy ecosystems in the Klamath Basin. That's why I work to secure major federal investments for these needs through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which includes measures from a bill that I've worked on since the last Congress. We call it the Future Western Water Infrastructure and Drought Resiliency Act. And the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law includes hundreds of millions in appropriations for Future Act programs. And these include a new aquatic ecosystem restoration program, a new watershed health program to allow the Bureau of Reclamation to support projects that restore aquatic ecosystems and improve the health of fish and wildlife. It is critical that Reclamation get to work expeditiously to set up these and other new programs to help address some of the major challenges we'll hear about today. These and other new resources can go a long way to benefit communities, fish, and wildlife in the basin. And one solution that could emerge from these investments is projects to modernize Trinity Dam, Trinity River being the largest lower basin tributary to the Klamath River. And we're going to have to do more to control temperatures on the Trinity River. Addressing this problem must be included in any plan to improve salmon numbers on the river. I also look forward to discussing investments to advance voluntary water transfers to support water for Klamath wildlife refuges. This will be critical to supporting waterfowl and migratory bird habitat during times of water shortage. And another key policy solution that we'll hear about today is the removal of 4 lower Klamath River dams. These dams fuel massive algal blooms every summer. They disrupt sacred ceremonies and sicken the fish that are at the very heart of tribal cultures and coastal communities. We've had some positive news on the FERC process lately with the recent release of a draft environmental impact statement. This is a major step toward removing these aging dams. But make no mistake, removing these dams is a big deal. It will provide permanent, significant benefits for water quality, river temperatures, and the survival of fish species that tribes and fishing communities depend on. I look forward to hearing more about these and other opportunities to advance solutions in the Klamath Basin. Today, we'll also hear testimony on impacts to farming communities, including those upstream in Ranking Member Benz's districts. Upstream communities are also facing major hardships and challenges to their livelihoods. There are significant resources in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to support farming communities as well. Most of these programs were authorized in the Western Water Package that was enacted in December 2020, which I also helped negotiate and support. And as I've said previously, I am committed to working in a problem-solving spirit across the aisle. We've done that before, and we need to keep doing it to address our challenges in the Klamath Basin and across the West. Many of the stakeholders in this basin have been engaged in litigation over water use for decades. It is time to find a path forward that breaks the status quo of litigation, risk, and uncertainty over water that plagues all sides year after year. I stand ready to work with Ranking Member Benz and others in the basin to find long-term solutions that provide water certainty for everyone. And with that, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Benz for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing on the Klamath River Basin conditions and opportunities. Certainly a timely hearing following the roundtables that were held over the last couple of weeks. Any problem or any solution, excuse me, requires a definition of the problem. And I think as we look at the Klamath, it is a long list of problems. I'll just mention a few, and I'm very happy for my witnesses who will go into more detail, about the challenges facing the basin on the farming side of things. First of all, when we're talking about the definition of the problem, of course, the drought. And as we know, Mr. Chair, the drought is of proportions that I don't think in length and duration that anyone was aware of or feared when many of the laws we're now dealing with were crafted. We're facing this drought, as you well know, across all of the Western United States, some 72 million people suffering from drought. Last year was bad. This year, apparently, sadly, is going to be perhaps worse. We continue with the list of the problems. We have any number of laws, many of which are inadequate for the purpose they're trying to serve. We've exhausted the groundwater, which was a fallback resource allowed access to last year. Now we know that hundreds of homes have lost their water and now are consigned to a future of hauling water in and living basically out of a tank of water. There's the unfortunate belief, and it became apparent, and I call this one of the problems, that the river somehow stands alone, that is autonomous, and it doesn't need to be concerned about the communities alongside it, or the ranchers that live in the upper reaches, or the farmers that are adjacent to it. The river is not a standalone thing. If it's going to be improved, it's going to require the communities that exist to step in and help out. There's one other problem that is obvious in the couple of years I've now been focused on this situation, and that is that there's a sense of blame almost in certain of the people talking about it. Either there's kind of it's due to climate change, and that's really your fault, or there's a sense of blame in that, the fish aren't there anymore, and that that's your fault, you farmers. And that is not a positive approach to any of this. So, Mr. Chair, I was happy to hear you remark on how it's time to work together. I couldn't agree with you more. But I just want to say the damage that's going on and will likely occur to the community, the Klamath Basin isn't just limited to Klamath Basin. I think the Klamath Basin is the tip of the spear, if you will, to all of the Western United States. And so I think it's extraordinarily important that we try to get what we're doing here today right. And by that, I mean looking really carefully at how we're going to plan what we're going to do. So I'm very much looking forward to people talking about the plan, and more to the point, where we're trying to go with the plan and what is that future vision, not just for the river, but for the people and communities and forests and creatures and refuges and 2 states. What is everyone trying to achieve? I know we're here today to talk about spending that $162 million, Mr. Chair. I strongly suggest that we talk about the plan so the money isn't wasted, as may have been the case with many other of the investments over the past 20 years. Mr. Chair, I know that my witness is going to call out in much more detail the incredible challenges facing the farming community. This is not to say there aren't challenges facing the in-stream interests. I'm sure that your witnesses will call those out. But at the end of this meeting, I hope we sit down and talk about how we're going to develop the plan and what the goals of that plan are. So with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back. But before I completely yield back, I want to ask unanimous consent that Congressman Doug LaMalfa of California be allowed to sit with the subcommittee and participate in the hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Without objection, Mr. LaMalfa will be joining us. So thank you for your remarks, Ranking Member Benz. And I understand that the full committee ranking member, Mr. Westerman, is also with us and would like to offer an opening statement. Mr. Westerman, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Do we have Mr. Westerman? I don't see him on my screen. So Ranking Member Benz, I do not mean to skip over Mr. Westerman, but I think we're going to have to proceed.
He is on his way, Mr. Chair. I was just told by helpful staff that he'll be here soon. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we will need to proceed with our first panel. We can come back to Mr. Westerman, but we'll now turn to testimony from our witnesses. Under committee rules, we ask them to limit oral statements to 5 minutes. But of course, the entire written statement for our witnesses will appear in the hearing record. To our witnesses, when you begin, the timer will start counting down and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute left. I recommend that members and witnesses who are joining remotely use the grid view so that they can lock the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself and avoid any inadvertent background noise. For our first panel, we'll hear from Mr. Steve Girton to testify on behalf of the Department of Interior. Mr. Girton is the Deputy Director for Program Management and Policy for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and he's accompanied by Mr. David Palumbo, Deputy Commissioner of Operations for the Bureau of Reclamation, who will be available to provide technical responses to member questions. The chair now recognizes Mr. Girton for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Steve Girton, Deputy Director for Policy for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm joined by Deputy Commissioner of Operations for the Bureau of Reclamation, David Palumbo, who can address any questions related to reclamation as needed. I appreciate this opportunity to testify on the Department of the Interior's response to the ongoing drought crisis in the Klamath Basin. Although drought is not new to the Klamath Basin, communities are facing conditions at a scale and intensity we have never seen. The impacts felt by people and fish and wildlife in 2022 are compounded by the difficult conditions of previous years and severe drought conditions in other basins across the West. There is no community, stakeholder, or species that is not dramatically and adversely impacted. Drought impacts have dramatically reduced wetland habitat. The annual migration of millions of birds has now been reduced to only tens of thousands. Klamath Basin fisheries are in severe decline, and several species of fish are listed under the Endangered Species Act. For tribal communities that rely on these species, these declines have caused significant hardship. We must protect the continued existence of these species and take meaningful steps to ensure their full recovery in order to fulfill our obligations to the Klamath Basin tribes and to meet the requirements of the Endangered Species Act. We also know water is a critical resource that supports crops and cattle across the basin, whereas there is a long history of productive farming and ranching, and where many farming families have operated for generations. Work to conserve fish and wildlife and their habitats, we are mindful of the variety of needs for water that touches everyone in the basin. The ecological infrastructure of the Klamath Basin is badly broken, making ecosystem restoration a critical component of our effort to address the ongoing drought crisis. There's an urgent need to work collaboratively with states, tribes, local governments, water users, and impacted communities to find innovative, long-term solutions. Together, we must work to respect tribal treaty rights and trust resources, ensure predictable and sustainable water supplies, and restore this once abundant ecosystem for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. I believe that we are starting to take important steps in that direction and that there is cause for hope. The department has been working with tribes, the states of Oregon and California, partners, and the communities for many years to make progress on natural resources conservation in the basin. For example, our Partners for Fish and Wildlife program has implemented voluntary habitat restoration projects with private landowners. Our national wildlife refuges are working collaboratively with the Klamath tribes to restore natural processes, and we're working closely with the Klamath Basin tribes to restore populations of Chinook and coho salmon and Lost River and short-nosed suckers. As we work toward long-term solutions, the department is aware and concerned that communities are necessarily focused on persistent drought and the threat that it poses to their way of life. Reclamation and other federal partners have provided tens of millions of dollars in assistance through local drought relief programs. As we work to improve water management in the basin, we will continue to engage stakeholders to the maximum extent practicable. The landmark Bipartisan Infrastructure Law provides an investment of more than $8 billion in reclamation programs to support water and drought resilience across the West. The infrastructure law also specifically addresses the crisis in the Klamath Basin by directing $162 million to restore the ecosystem and identify additional opportunities to support water resilience and infrastructure. This new funding represents a down payment on a brighter future for the Klamath Basin and will go a long way to address a number of the basin's highest priority restoration efforts. Thanks to this significant investment, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to foster a collective effort to address complex water challenges and build that brighter future for the Klamath Basin. The department is committed to transparency, collaboration, and continuous improvement as we address climate change and pursue long-term solutions in the Klamath Basin for current and future generations. Thank you for the continued interest of the Congress and this committee in building a more sustainable future, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gurton. Appreciate that. Want to remind members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for questions that they may have for the first panel. And I will begin by recognizing myself. Mr. Gurton, we'll hear today from downstream tribes about the incredible hardships that they face due to both drought and water management decisions. Could you tell us about the department's tribal trust obligations and tribal treaty rights, obligations that have to be factored in to the department's management decisions in the Klamath Basin?
Thank you for your question, Chairman. The department certainly has many legal obligations to identify, protect, and conserve the tribal resources, trust resources of federally recognized tribes and tribal members. Within the service, we consult with tribal governments to improve and enhance conservation of fish, wildlife resources, and advance shared natural and cultural resource and goals. For example, coho and Chinook salmon and Lost River and short-nosed suckers are all species of central importance to the Klamath Basin tribes. Any decision that we make related to water management of these species will certainly be working hand in glove with the tribes to improve their status. We do that through tribal coordination on our hatchery, stakeholder sessions, and most recently, with the BIL in mind, 6 government-to-government consultations were taking place, and Secretary of the Interior conducted 3 national-level tribal consultations, including one for West Coast tribes as well.
I appreciate that. Want to address the lower Klamath Dams and the opportunity to remove them, opening up 420 miles of historic salmon spawning habitat, something that will improve water quality and avoid the need to implement other costly mitigation measures in order to meet those tribal trust obligations that you just described. But it is imperative that we make sure that the river is healthy enough to support robust fish runs and a healthy ecosystem by the time that the dams are removed. So I want to ask you, Mr. Girton, what can be done to make sure we're ready to hit the ground running soon, as soon as next year, to support healthy ecosystems after the dams come down? And also, can any of these efforts be expedited by investments that were included in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman. Certainly, the removal of those dams will contribute to the overall health of the ecosystem by reconnecting salmon and other fishery species to their historic habitat. We view this as a very powerful 1-2 punch in conjunction with funding provided with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Specifically, the service has been entrusted with $162 million. We're planning to work closely with all stakeholders. In fact, our request for proposals is coming out this week. We invited counties, the tribes, and other stakeholders to help us draft the request for proposal. That will put $15 million on the ground this summer and fall to start habitat restoration projects, reconnecting and building some infrastructure for the future as well. But the complementary nature of taking out those dams and this ongoing investment in the BIL will both contribute to restoring the ecological function of the watershed and that healthy ecosystem that all stakeholders need.
Mr. Girton, I previously mentioned some of the new authorities created under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Could you describe the progress that Reclamation has made in setting up these new programs?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With your permission, I will pivot to the Deputy Commissioner for Bureau of Reclamation, who's accompanying me here, to take that question for you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Deputy Director Girton. Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to answer this question. Reclamation sincerely appreciates all the efforts that you've made with respect to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The $8.3 billion Reclamation received will benefit ecosystems tremendously. Our Water Smart program currently has 5 funding opportunity announcements out on the street using bill funding. The aquatic ecosystem program that was funded under bill for $250 million. We have developed draft criteria. We're going to be sharing that draft criteria with the public this summer. And the $100 million that was added for watershed health. Also, we are developing draft criteria, trying to commingle that with some existing programs to get that money out on the street as soon as possible. We expect to be sharing that plan with the public this summer as well.
Appreciate that. I didn't mean to cut you off. Was there more?
No, that's if that's responsive to your question, that's all I had.
No, that's terrific. Thank you for that. And Ranking Member Benz has pointed out correctly that I'm talking a lot about fish and wildlife and river restoration and salmon and dams in the lower river. I do not mean to suggest that the $162 million in watershed and environmental restoration funding that we've been talking about is the only thing going on. In fact, I want to emphasize that tens of millions of dollars for drought response funding, including in 2018, again in 2020, 21. USDA is now providing $15 million for new drought pilot projects. And then there's tens of millions of competitive grant opportunities as well under the legislation that we've passed for some of the agricultural and other stakeholders. So we care about that too. There are resources for that too. And I just wanted to close with that. Ranking Member Benz, I understand that Mr. Westerman is back. Would you like us to go to him, or did you want to go next?
Oh, I'll go next. Thank you.
All right. Let me recognize you then. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Girton, I'm interested, of course, in how the $162 million is going to be spent. But can you, if you can't give this to me now, perhaps you can get the information for me. But how much money have we already spent in that basin over, let's just say, the last 10 years when it comes to fish recovery? Do you have that number, a rough estimate, or can you get it for me?
Thank you for your question, Ranking Member Benz. I don't have a fact, to give you right off the top of my head, we can compile that for you through our division of budget, but in very general terms, it would include the base operating budget for our National Wildlife Refuge complex there, the initial startup cost for our hatchery, some ES and Partners for Fish and Wildlife program work we're doing. I would hazard a guess it's probably an $8 to $10 million a year annual expenditure. And then the last couple of years, we've seen some congressional ads to start work on the hatchery, as well as some habitat restoration work as well. But we'd be pleased to compile a kind of budget estimate for you of actual obligations to date for the last 10 years.
And thank you for that. I appreciate that. And while we're talking about money, I want to thank the Bureau Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Interior for the absolutely essential help in funding some of the losses that occurred last year. And I anticipate we'll be looking for that same kind of help in this coming year, much to our dismay. And I would also point out that many of the programs that the chair alluded to anticipate at least some amount of water, for example, conservation efforts and things of that nature. But when you have no water, those programs are of very little help. And so repairing ditches and canals when there's no water to put in them, it's pretty sad. So I just want to go back, if I might, Mr. Girton, to the wildlife that were damaged as a result of no water going into the refuge this year. And I note in your testimony, you talk about Tule Lake National Wildlife Refuge, Sump 1B, but that's just a fraction, is it not, of what normally would be available to the waterfowl of the district. Can you give us some indication of how much damage has been done in numbers, or whatever your best estimate of how much loss of waterfowl has occurred as a result of not having water diverted into the refuges over the past year?
Thank you for your question, Ranking Member Bentz. We've seen significant impacts to the waterfowl population. As you're well aware, this was the largest wetland west of the Mississippi, central to the Pacific Flyway. We used to see millions and millions of waterfowl coming through in the migration season. We saw tens of thousands potentially. We know at least 60,000 birds died from botulism, other avian diseases. These animals have just moved elsewhere. That's made a big difference or impact to the negative or detriment of our hunting community and those who depend on sport hunting and outdoor recreation industry as well. So we've seen some pretty dire impacts to our waterfowl populations due to these low water levels.
It is extraordinarily sad. Let's turn our attention to the direction and where you will seek direction for the investment of the 30 some odd million. I understand the 162 spread over time, but perhaps if we had other money come in, as the chair suggested we might, where do you look for the direction and how best to invest it so that we don't continue to do the things that haven't worked out well for the fish? Again, tell me, where are you finding direction and how to invest this money?
Thank you for your question, Ranking Member Bentz. We're turning to our leadership cadre in the watershed, congressional leadership, middle agency, tribal leaders, to our stakeholders in ranching and farming, to the local communities, state fish and game agencies. There's been a number of stakeholder engagement seminars that have taken place. One will take place again tomorrow. From a purely mechanical point of view, we had to prepare what's called a spend plan that OMB had to bless for us that kind of talked about a vision going forward. But our direction in the department is to take that initial planning document out to the basin there and work with people who live in the watershed, make a living in the watershed, utilize the watershed to help us frame up the metrics going forward. And we began that process by issuing our request for proposals this week for the first tranche of $15 million. We invited county leadership and tribal leadership to help us write that proposal to begin with to address their needs. We anticipate getting that project dollars on the ground this summer as a down payment moving forward. We're also very closely working with our stakeholder partners on the planning for the new hatchery. That will be a critical investment going forward to help us restore the 2 species of suckers that are vitally important to our tribal partners. And coupled together with the pending dam removal, it's just an integrated package, a larger strategy toward a healthy, flourishing ecosystem, a working landscape where tribal members, agriculture, the communities, fishers downstream, all can move forward together and have a much brighter future.
Thank you, Mr. Girton. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Is Mr. Westerman with us? If not, Mr. Benz, do you have a, there he is. All right. We finally
Chairman?
got you, Bruce. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Is this for an opening statement or questions?
Well, it's your time. It's,
Well, I'm confused a little bit whether I'm getting to ask questions, because are we not going to go back and forth, one Republican, one Democrat? Or you just tell me what I'm recognized for and I'm ready to go.
I don't have a Democrat ready with questions. So we are in the question section for the first panel. If you're ready to go with that, I'm happy to recognize you. If not, we can keep moving.
I'm ready to go. Appreciate thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the witness for being here. And Mr. Girton, as Mr. Bentz mentioned, there is a need for a plan. And in that vein, what are the Department of Interior's next steps? And in particular, what's the department's end game when it comes to the Klamath Basin?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Ranking Member. The end game is a healthy, functioning, connected watershed that can support all of the equities of our partners. That would mean honoring tribal trust commitments. That would mean a healthy and flourishing agricultural segment for our farmers and ranchers. That would mean outdoor recreation, duck hunters, anglers, and others. That would mean supporting communities in the basin and our fishers who also make a living off of this watershed. Coupled with that would be a healthy and flourishing wildlife that many of these actions depend on. And coupled with that would be demonstrating to taxpayers that the department has adequately and professionally deployed and executed all the funding that was entrusted to us to reconnect the watershed, put in place a stronger regime going forward, and support a vibrant ecosystem and community.
So over the last few decades, water supply in the Klamath project has been reduced and at times eliminated. And my understanding, a major reason provided by federal agencies, including the service, has been to maintain surface elevations in the upper Klamath Lake at higher levels than they would be if irrigators were able to use the water. To the average person, it appears to be plenty of water in the upper Klamath Lake for all to use. Is there any evidence that you can provide today and for the record in which eliminating water deliveries has yielded specific and tangible benefits in the form of increased populations of the endangered sucker species?
We'd have to provide some more technical information for you for the record, Mr. Ranking Member. What we strive to do at all times is balance the needs of the suckers in the upper Klamath watershed with inflow streams needed for coho salmon and chinook and other species in the main stem of the river as well. To us, we don't prioritize any one species over any other entity. It's all striving to reach that elusive balance. And again, coming back to the recognition that there are many equities in the watershed. All of them deserve a seat at the table. And that brings us back to our hope for the future as we work with Congress on implementing the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and couple that with the pending dam removal to start this long-term restoration of the ecological function of the watershed. And we would be glad to give you some more data
It would be good to see if there's any evidence where this species has actually been helped. It seems like having the dam there in the first place has probably helped the species, since there was no lake before there was a dam, so there was no opportunity for them to spawn there in that area. So what's your discretion under ESA regulations and related operating plans to provide water to farmers?
So what we try to do with our interim operating plan is first base it on the best available science. We view the interim operating plan as almost a bridge to get us through our development of a new water management plan. Both our agency and NIMS have provided biological opinions to the Bureau of Reclamation. NIMS certainly focused on their equity, which would be managing in-stream flows for salmon, particularly necessary to address the sea Shasta parasite from minimizing impacts on salmon species. And our interest would be on balancing that with rearing habitat for the 2 sucker species in the lakes. At the same time, the IOP or operating plan strives to provide a fair allocation for farmers and ranchers as well. As you know, the main challenge is implementation coincided with one of the worst drought years on record. And last year, flow targets were not met. Lake level targets were not met. Farmers and ranchers received no water, and the refuge itself went dry. We're now working.
And
with
Mr. Gurdon, I got one last question I want to get out
Yes, sir.
there, and you may have to answer it in writing, but it's my understanding that there will be no cost to the taxpayer for the removal of the 4 hydroelectric dams, the Pacific Coast dams. Is that correct?
My understanding, Mr. Ranking Member, is that that would be privately funded and at no cost to the taxpayers. Yes, sir.
Will the federal government not have to provide some fish passage facilities when these dams come out?
We have the opportunity, sir, with the new BIL funding, as well as the BIL provided an additional 200 million specifically for fish passage that could be brought to bear if it's needed during the perk licensing and dam removal process. So we can certainly look at that. Yes, sir.
I was asking if you could get an estimate of how much the cost will be for those, and also for the fish screens for diversions immediately upstream of the Keno Dam with this project. It appears there will be cost to the federal government. And appreciate the extra time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
All right, thank you, Mr. Westerman. I'm going to let Ranking Member Benz have a sidebar with you to explain that Klamath Lake is a natural lake and was not created by a dam. But we will move on. I think Mr. Lowenthal is next, and we'll recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing. Mr. Gurdon, my question is, I'm going to refers to the birds that travel along the Pacific Flyway and who use a series of the Klamath Wildlife Refuges as a critical stopover during their annual migrations. But these refuges are vulnerable to drought conditions and limited water supplies. I understand that the drought conditions at the Klamath in 2012 led to overcrowded habitats and an avian botulism outbreak that killed 60,000 birds. Mr. Gurdon, can you tell us more about the species that rely on these wildlife refuges and how drought poses risks, not just for the habitats in the Klamath Basin, but for migratory birds up and down the West Coast?
So thank you for your question, Congressman. Sure, we've got 6 national wildlife refuges that comprise our Klamath Basin complex, and its mission is to protect what remains of what was once the largest wetland area west of the Mississippi River. These remaining wetlands there are very highly managed, but they're a critical part of our Pacific Flyway, which was the corridor for migratory waterfowl during their migration season. So they can rest and refuel during both their spring and fall migrations. The persistent drought we're seeing has certainly had very significant impacts to this Pacific Flyway. And last year, we know that in excess of 60,000 birds did in fact die from botulism due to outbreaks exacerbated by the low water level. So with no water at some of the refuges, many of these waterfowl have skipped their important stopover sites, and they concluded their migration exhausted and in very poor condition. And as the health abundance of birds in the Pacific Flyway declines, we're also seeing then a reduction in hunting opportunities for our constituent groups who are outdoor recreationists. We know how important these wildlife are to our constituents, and so we're continuing to create and seek conditions to improve waterfowl habitat as best we can. But it's a, sir, a very dire situation as it is for many of the stakeholders in the basin.
Thank you. It sounds like what you're saying is that the lack of water supply certainty for habitats will continue to leave these refuges vulnerable to periodic water shortages in an often over-allocated system. I'm curious about whether there are opportunities for equitable water solutions that can support the refuges, as well as the variety of other critical water needs in the Klamath Basin. Can you describe whether voluntary water transfers or other approaches can provide solutions for the Klamath and how the Department of Interior could support these efforts?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. So sure, last year we were very fortunate. Our partners in California waterfowl actually worked with a water rights holder to purchase his rights for transfer to the lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge. As part of that process, we worked very closely with our counterparts in the Bureau of Reclamation to ensure that that transfer would cause no harm to the Klamath project, harmless. Other water right users have approached us as well and have indicated a willingness to voluntarily sell their water as well. This is a very promising opportunity for waterfowl and for habitat and for wildlife in general. We are optimistic this could become a durable approach going forward. But again, in the Klamath Basin, we want to make sure that any water transfer has to avoid harm to other users and stakeholders. That concept of the trade-offs or making sure there's always balance in the system. But thank you for your question, sir.
I only have a few seconds left, and the Fish and Wildlife Service received $162 million for the Klamath Basin in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. How can that funding be deployed to support the collaborative solutions at the Klamath Wildlife Refuges?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. Very briefly, that $162 million is designed for on-the-ground habitat restoration. It's designed to be employed in conjunction with the wishes and views and priorities of our tribal partners, the agricultural community, communities, fishers downstream, all stakeholders. It will be used, mostly delivered through our Partners for Conservation Private Lands program, all on a voluntary basis. It can be part of the package to provide this durable, long-term collaborative solution for the community out there. And for our mission, it will certainly benefit all of the resources we in the state fish and game and the tribes are entrusted with managing for the American people.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Graves, or as we know him on the Zoom screen, G's iPad, if he is there. We may not have Mr. Graves in the flesh, so I believe next in line would be Mr. Lamalfa. Mr. Lamalfa, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for allowing me to sit in my old committee once again. And thank you, colleagues, as well. I appreciate the time. Mr. Gerton, appreciate your attendance and your information you can bring us today. What we're looking at in the basin was the Klamath project was authorized by Congress in 1905. It's been built out to many, many miles of ditches and canals and drainage ditches that had served 200,000 acres of farmland, 1,400 farms. And one of the hitches to that is that the farmers still pay every year $30 million to maintain the Klamath project, including last year when they received zero water. So after the passage of the NEPA in 70 and the ESA in 73, the Bureau started changing the operations. So the state of Oregon, their own courts started an adjudication process, which took many years, but finally, in the end, the Oregon state ruled that the Bureau had a reserved water right. It could only apply to the primary purpose, and that purpose is defined as agriculture exclusively for the water that was added to the height of the original low lake. The project water belongs to agriculture. That number is in the hundreds of thousands of acre feet. So what we're talking about here is a situation where at the beginning of the hearing, the discussion was water certainty. Okay, we want water certainty for the users on the lake. So I guess going forward, Mr. Gurdon, are we going to define water certainty for agriculture as 0%? We'll just forget about it. We have zero agriculture in the basin on either side, either on Mr. Bentz's side or my side of the border.
So thank you for your question, Congressman. My understanding is there's no desire to prioritize any one user group over any others. We're trying to reach a consensus, collaborative solution, a durable solution going forward that will balance out all of the legitimate needs of all the stakeholders, including agriculture, the tribes, wildlife, the hunting and angling community, and other.
Mr. Gurdon, you talk about balance, though. You're talking about balance. You're balancing on the back of a water right the federal government does not have to give to fish and wildlife or other concerns. The project water belongs to agriculture. That top 6 or 7 feet that was built starting in 1905 is the project water is devoted to agriculture. And the federal government has been pilfering that water for many years now for these other uses. Now, if you're talking about the original existing lower lake and basically the swamp area of the upper lake, that would be where maybe you would have a historic right for fish and the tribal needs you're talking about. But the upper lake, that water would not exist had that dam, that link dam, not been built to enhance the size of the lake. So how do you acknowledge that in this case, the federal government is trampling on a state water right, but down in California, in the Shasta Dam and those other water rights that BOR is managing down there, they're deferring to the State Water Resources Control Board in order to have water continue to flow needlessly out the Delta, and agriculture in San Joaquin, parts of Sacramento Valley are getting 0% there. Which one is it? Is the state's rights going to be recognized by the federal government in Oregon and California, or only Oregon, or only California and not Oregon?
Mr. Congressman, I'm going to defer that question to my colleague from the Bureau of Reclamation. He probably has a better ability to answer your specific questions on the water allocation issue. So with your encouragement, I'm going to pivot to the Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau of Reclamation, who's accompanied me to the hearing.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Deputy Director Gurdon. Thank you, Congressman Malfa. Appreciate the opportunity to address this question. The Bureau of Reclamation, with our attorneys and the solicitor's office, are looking at state water rights versus federal water rights and other requirements that we have that are incumbent upon us to manage our systems effectively and efficiently, balancing all of the needs, whether it be needs of agriculture and ranchers, whether it be the needs of fish or ecosystems, or the needs of tribes. There's a variety of competing demands and legal perspectives on that, and we work through those on a daily basis, whether it be in the Central Valley project or in the Klamath Basin. Our objective is to make sure that we provide water to the agricultural community, we satisfy our ecosystem needs, and we provide water to tribes.
But back up for a minute here. How do you satisfy the need for the ecosystem with water that is not your right under the primary purpose of the Klamath project, adjudicated by Oregon courts to say this is agriculture only water at the top of the lake? How do you just take that water to balance your needs and the ones Fish and Wildlife dictates to you?
I appreciate the question,
In just a few seconds, why don't you give a wrap-up answer to that?
Thank you.
I'll just say there is a legal deliberation with respect to that question. There's a variety of perspectives. Federal government is pursuing answers to those questions, and at the same time trying to manage our systems simultaneously as we deal with those legal matters.
All right, the gentleman's time has
Thank you,
expired.
Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes Mr. Costa for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I think this is an important issue as we deal with river basin watersheds throughout the country, obviously in the West, and I've had some experience for 42 years in dealing with river water basins in the Great Central Valley, the Sacramento River, and the San Joaquin River. When you deal with issues that is before this subcommittee, you're dealing with competing demands, and that those competing demands have always weighed heavily on the decisions that are made based upon beneficial use doctrine and water rights that go back to Indian tribes and all of the other demands here. As an example, the extreme drought conditions we're facing with climate change, obviously we have to be mindful of. And how we operated these projects as we began to better understand the impacts of climate change and water reliability on 10-year averages, obviously is part of the challenge we deal with today. University of California, Merced, released a study on the impacts of drought, and we're sadly once again in extreme drought conditions in California, but indicated that last year in 2021, that California's ag industry had $1.1 billion of losses and over 8,700 jobs. I guess, you know, my perspective is how do we in Congress look to mitigate and prevent heavy economic and societal costs caused by droughts and climate change? Mr. Girton, how is the Trinity River Division integrated in the Central Valley Project operations, and what factor does Reclamation consider when making decisions regarding operations of the Trinity River?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. I'm going to defer to my colleague, the Deputy Commissioner from Bureau of Reclamation, who have jurisdictional authority over that project. Here's Commissioner Colombo.
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman Costa. Good to see you again. With respect to the Trinity River, Reclamation has a variety of programs that it must adhere to, including the Trinity River Restoration Program, the Central Valley Project, a variety of contracts up and down.
No, we're aware of that, but my time's limited. Get to the heart of the answer.
Could you repeat directly what you'd like to hear from me?
I said, to what degree do you integrate on the Trinity River Division or Central Valley projects, and what factors does Reclamation consider when making these decisions regarding the Trinity River Division?
Thank you. So the Trinity River and the Central Valley Project are linked. We look at water demands needed for the Central Valley Project. We look at requirements in the Trinity River, and we need to uphold our operations to address both of those demands, whether it be for temperature management in the Sacramento River or flows down the Trinity River to the mouth of through the Klamath. So there's a variety of factors that we take into consideration, and it's a function of the hydrology at the time.
Well, I understand that. I appreciate the detailed response. I'd like that in written form, and we can share it with members of the committee. Let me ask you a follow-up question. Since 2010, how much water from the Trinity River Division has been imported into the Sacramento watershed for delivery to CVP contractors? That's the first question. The second, as a result of CVP contractors over that 11-year period, how much was delivered to Westlands Irrigation District, which I represent?
Congressman, I'm going to have to get back to you on those exact numbers. There is a substantial portion of water that comes out of the Trinity that goes to the.
No, I know.
But I'll get you
I'm asking you a specific question. Let me finally close with my 28 seconds left. The competing demands again, whether we're talking about farmers and agriculture, which is critical in my view, it's a national security issue, it's food on America's dinner table, whether we're talking about Native Americans that have rights that are historical, as are some of the other water rights, or whether we're talking about the wetlands. I represent grasslands, the largest contiguous wetlands in the United States on the part of the Pacific Flyway. We have to balance these needs. That's the bottom line. Appreciate the hearing. I look forward to the second panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Curtin. Just, I'm curious, what happens to the Iron Gate Fish Hatchery when we tear down the Iron Gate Dam?
Pardon me, sir, the Iron Gate Fish Hatchery?
Yeah.
What we're going to be doing, sir, is moving a lot of that capacity into other efforts going on. As you know, we also have the BIL funding that will provide funding up above there for all the work that will be done on the short nose and
The answer,
suckers as well.
let's not be disingenuous. The answer is it ceases to function, correct?
Well, yes, sir.
Well, thank you for that direct answer. It ceases to function. 5 million salmon smolts a year that the fish hatchery produces ceases to be produced.
Yes, sir. That hatchery would go out.
17,000 of those come back every year as fully grown salmon to spawn into the Klamath, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're going to tear all of that down in the name of the salmon. This is absolute insanity. I'll yield the rest of my time to Mr. Lamal.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, my colleague, Mr. McClintock, on that time. I'd still like to return to some of these previous thoughts on the infrastructure. It's there. There was a conversation a bit ago about Keno Dam perhaps needing to be altered, and it is not one of the 4 dams that are on the hit list to be removed. It's actually above stream. Are there plans to alter also the Keno Dam or remove it?
Sir, I'm not as very well versed on that, probably as I should be, but what we're looking at as this project comes online is doing a lot of consultation with all of the stakeholders, working toward the long-term planning process out there. And we can get you more information or a standalone briefing for you if that would be helpful.
Not a lot of information on that at this time. Okay, so and previously we were talking about no cost to taxpayers for any of this work for dam removal. I would have to remind everybody here on the committee and everybody participating that there indeed is a cost built in of $250 million being put forward by California taxpayers through the state bond, the so-called water bond, that has seen nothing expended so far to actually build water supply in California, but the money for other things is moving right along. And $200 million from the Pacific Core ratepayers that have had taken added to their bills over several years to remove the dams. So that's at least 450. And on top of that, there's a shell corporation called the KRRC that takes ownership of the dams from Pacific Core that has no assets, no backing of any sort. Now, when they put forward a plan for KRRC to take possession of the dams, FERC actually balked at that and required more backing come in. So now the state of Oregon and state of California taxpayers are going to have to be the line of credit on the inevitable cost overruns that $450 million won't cover for the cost of the removing of the 4 dams. Indeed, they've already spent 30, 40, maybe $50 million of that 450 on planning and such leading up to that. So we come back to, there is a cost to taxpayers and a lot of uncertainty as to what's going on. Mr. Girton, were you aware that before these dams were built, before the river had anything done, that the geological survey shows that there was a 130-foot tall reef in the river that would have prevented fish passage past where that reef was, somewhere around the Copco dams? How in the world are we talking fish passage and all these amazing things that taking clean, green, renewable power out for 70,000 homes at this time of a crunch in our grid? How is this going to help fish habitat when they would have never have migrated past the reef that originally existed before any of this?
Sure, Congressman, there's just going to be a lot of work done as these dams are envisioned for the project to remove them. We are going to be one of many federal agencies advising on that, along with the National Marine Fisheries Service and others as well. We will work through the long-term planning process.
Mr. Girton, that is not an answer. You're giving me word salad here, okay? You have to acknowledge that there was things before these dams that prevented fish passage. And just saying we're having a new plan doesn't mean that this existed beforehand. Therefore, there's history on that based on very sketchy evidence doesn't exist.
I acknowledge your point, sir. Yes, I do.
And so this dam removal is not going to do all these amazing restoration things that are being talked about. And indeed, what is already a warm lake with a lot of phosphate in it that is not the same as the upper fish passages that you see in Oregon and Washington. So I do not understand why so little actual science has been put out on all these aspects, and we move forward on removing dams that actually provide a lot of benefits, including power, and how how your agency is so dedicated to that without having all the science. How is that, sir?
Sir, we use the best science we can find. We've done a lot of work in the watershed.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you,
And
Mr. Chairman.
yeah, I will just ask at this point unanimous consent to enter into the record a commentary that is posted at klamathtribes.org on how salmon historically migrated past Klamath Falls in response to the theory we just heard, including records back to 1846 from John Fremont of getting salmon from Indians in Upper Klamath Lake. So we'll ask that we enter that into the record to keep things factual. And with that, the chair recognizes Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gurton, what funding has the department provided for the tribes in the Klamath Basin to help offset the devastating drought? And does the infrastructure law provide additional resources to potentially support tribal communities impacted? And how can the funding support long-term solutions?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. Our colleagues at the Reclamation Agency here in Interior have provided funding to Klamath tribes for wells, groundwater monitoring, stream enhancement projects, and other system improvements. Our efforts in the BIL are more focused on the restoration of species and ecosystems and focused on collaborative work to propagate endangered suckers and restoring waterways within the tribal's traditional homelands. The infrastructure law would also provide a lot of additional capacity to tribal communities in the Klamath Basin and throughout the West. The infrastructure law, for example, provides, I think it's about $13 billion directly to tribal communities across the country and makes tribal communities eligible for billions more in much needed investments. That includes about $6 billion to support water infrastructure in tribal communities, $172 million to provide report for salmon recovery efforts, and $60 million for tribal fish passage improvements. And the administration is certainly committed to ensure that federal infrastructure funding reaches all of our tribal community partners.
How soon will that funding be available to the tribes?
So this money is being rolled out as we speak. A lot of requests for proposals have been announced. Our little agency has a $15 million RFP on the street this week, as a matter of fact, to start some of the ecological work that we're going to be doing. There is also funding coming online from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Reclamation, a series of RFPs. Some of this project funding will be available for the tribes as early as this summer, and then into the fall and each of the 5 years for the duration of the legislation.
Well, after the RFPs are submitted, how soon before they're granted the funds so they can start to work?
So an example would be for our funding that we're going to provide. The RFP goes out this week. Tentative deadline for year one projects will be first week of May. In about 2 months' time, we'll review the projects during the period of May and June. Mid-June to late July, we'll be making the funding decisions. We'll process the grants in July and August, and we plan to award the funding to tribes and other partners the August-September timeframe in about 5 or 6 months from now.
Okay. Ms. Cordalis. Oh, I'm sorry. That's this session. It certainly looks like they're getting some help, but are they going to be able to use it in time to get some benefit this year?
This calendar year, certainly, Congresswoman, as the projects come out and move into a project implementation phase by this fall, given weather and other factors, tribal and other partners should be able to start turning dirt on some of the earlier projects this calendar year.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for 5 minutes. You're muted, Jennifer.
No,
There you go. We
Can
got
you
you.
hear me now? Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for this hearing. I would like to yield my time to Mr. Lamalfa, which is his district, and I will be more than happy to yield to him.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez. I really appreciate that. And I'll just want to continue on this line here with Mr. Girton on, so far what we've kind of covered is that the federal government, whether it's Fish and Wildlife or the Bureau, respects state water rights and state boards when it comes to California, but not in Oregon when the state courts have adjudicated the usage of Klamath Project water to be its primary purpose is defined as agriculture. So we have different ways of looking at the state depending on which one, and both of them just happen to be going in the direction that the more water is being taken from agriculture in each case and given to fish projects. So do you see any conflict with that, Mr. Girton?
The way the different states are allocating their water resources, sir.
Sorry?
You're asking, do I see a conflict with the way the states are allocating their water resources differently?
The way the federal government is treating one state favorably, or actually respecting what California does, but not respecting what Oregon's rights are, or what Oregon's decision is on water right.
Yeah, so Congressman, I apologize. That's a very complex legal matter. I don't believe I would give you a very adequate or satisfactory response on that. We would be glad to follow up with some more legally interpretation of that, if that would be helpful to you, sir. I'm just not an adequate witness on that front to give you an intelligent
Okay.
answer.
All right, I'd appreciate follow-up on that. Do you think it's right then, Mr. Girton, that as a federal entity, whether it's yourself looking at it or the Bureau, that the farmers are paying $30 million a year to maintain a project that now delivers zero water to them? And getting, that was that way in 2021, looks like it might well be for 2022. They barely got their deliveries in 2020 when mid-season, it was almost decided to take away their water as they already had crops planted in the field. So is that right that they should continue to pay in this and somehow lose their rights by if they should not pay that?
Congressman, I feel very badly for what's happened to farmers and ranchers in the valley. I know that they're involved in a very long-term and probably torturous legal process that they've weathered for the last couple of cycles, particularly during this drought year here. All I can say from the perspective of our agency is that we're trying to bring together all of these disparate needs in the watershed and come up with a longer-term and more durable solution to give everybody what they deserve, a lot more certainty going forward. And we're hitching our wagon to this funding in the BIL. We think it will provide a lot of capacity, do a lot of work on the ground. We're working closely with agriculture and irrigation districts and others to try and make sure they're part of this long-term solution to their frustration.
Sir, if indeed we have a situation where water is in a cycle where it's a lot less plentiful, we have a situation where more water is being promised to fish than it even exists, as well as the whole troublesome aspect that people need the water in the basin. We'll be hearing from our next witnesses on that. They've lost so much they need for their households, etc. And ag's clear right in the basin towards the Klamath Project water when it's available. So how do you square all those together with that?
We're trying, Congressman. The water is not there to meet all the needs. We're certainly not prioritizing a fish or any other species over people.
No, yes, you are. You're doing it there. You're doing it down in the Central Valley. There's zero mention of agriculture in documents having to do with Shasta Dam or up here. It's always an afterthought now. And you might be noticing in the world food supply here that things are getting desperate. So I guess if we're looking at things in a new way, you're still applying old data, old goals to a changing dynamic of water availability in a drought, a long-year drought. Hey, if you want to call it climate change or global warming, you still have fish goals that surpass by far any of the other so-called co-equal needs.
Congressman,
The
Yeah.
gentleman's time has expired. And, we will hear from some witnesses in the next panel about whether there has been an imbalance in favor of fish and tribes downstream. I think they'll have some interesting insights to that question. The chair now recognizes
Okay,
Mr. Soto.
the farmers
for 5
we'll be
minutes.
hearing from them. That'll be good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Gerten, for your efforts with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help protect the environment in Florida. We were very pleased by the $1 billion award for Everglades restoration in our state, the biggest in our history. We're very grateful on that. That's where a lot of the positive is happening. We also have challenges, particularly with regard to the continuing unusual mortality event with our manatees. We're very grateful for your response and that of Deputy Secretary Estenos in allowing for the waiver for feedings to happen. And those have made a difference. They're not perfect, obviously, and it takes the manatees some time to adjust to this. We're still seeing, even with those efforts, unusual mortality events occurring in Florida. So it'd be great to get an update on what you're seeing in addition to the comments I've heard from constituents about this in the Indian River Lagoon.
thank you for your questions, Congressman. I checked in with our Unified Command last night down in Euro. As you're seeing, we were very fortunate. We had a warmer December, probably February and January, equivalent to last year, a lot of cold. And March is looking very favorable for us. That pilot supplemental feeding program got off to a start, but at its peak, there were probably 900 animals congregating there. And we were able to deploy almost 100,000 pounds of mixed produce, mostly romaine lettuce, paid for by donations to the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. There are currently 30 to 70 animals there in the feed location. Most of them have largely dispersed, which is very encouraging. So we really think that supplemental feeding program was a good tool we can have for future to help us manage us through the UME if it unfortunately were to continue. There's also been a great amount of just robust partner work with our rescue operations and rehab operations. A lot of private entities and groups and others have stepped up. We have very quick response times, and more partners are agreeing to take some of these animals into refugia and overwinter them and get them back to health and bring them out there, return them onto the landscape. And we're working closely with all the partners in the environment down there on addressing the longer term strategy of water quality as well. Thank you for your attention and leadership on this whole issue as well.
And thank you, Director Gerten. We know you all are working together with the state as best you can. The development along that river has sadly degraded it down. We're seeing population pressures in other areas of Florida too, but some victories. The Kissimmee River restoration was just finished just this last July, and through this committee, we've passed a bill to make it a wild and scenic river. Now, we've agreed to contemporaneously allow for that study to happen, so it'd be great to know if you all are starting to conduct that study or not.
We're looking into that right now, Congressman, and glad to give you updates as we move forward with our planning process.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. Glad we could make Mr. Gerten available for a little Florida conversation on manatees. We're here to serve. So thank you, Mr. Gerten. That concludes our first panel. And before introducing the witnesses in the second panel, I will remind non-administration witnesses that they're encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey that was created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation for more information on that. I would like to remind witnesses to mute yourself when you're not speaking so that we can avoid inadvertent background noise, and I'll allow all the witnesses to testify before we begin questions. We'll hear first from Ms. Amy Cordalis, a counsel for the Yurok Tribe and principal of the Ridges to Riffles Conservation Fund. The chair now recognizes Ms. Cordalis for 5 minutes.
There we go. Thank you, Congressman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and Subcommittee members for the invitation to testify today. My name is Amy Cordalis. I'm a member of the Yurok Tribe, a fisherwoman and attorney for the Yurok Tribe. The federal government supported the development of the Upper Klamath Basin in the early 1900s as a part of its push to settle the West. This development is now an obstacle to all livelihoods in the basin, both human and species, because it resulted in unsustainable uses of Klamath Basin resources. A century of wetland draining, farming, water withdrawals, and landscape scale alterations have brought the aquatic ecosystems of the Klamath Basin to their knees. Water quality deterioration, water withdrawals causing minimum flows and lake levels to be extremely low, habitat loss have combined to bring the historically abundant Klamath to its breaking point. At Yurok, we experience the basin's demise firsthand. The Yurok Tribe is the largest tribe in California. Our reservation, created in 1855, straddles the lower 45 miles of the Klamath River, 1 mile on either side of the river. Although one of the first legal commitments the federal government ever made was to my ancestors to preserve the lower Klamath River as a permanent homeland where we could be safe and continue our way of life, only 1 to 3% of the iconic salmon runs of the Klamath remain, and many other species we depend upon for our survival are moving toward extinction. Even more troubling is that within the last 18 months, 5 Yurok women have gone missing. Indeed, the Yurok Reservation has some of the highest rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the country. Today, the Yurok people, along with the species we rely upon, are quite literally disappearing. Most communities in the basin feel helpless because there's too little water, too much demand, and basin-wide ecosystem and economic failure. Some irrigators have responded by illegally taking waters. Others turn to the courts. The tribe cancels its fishery. The cycle continues. Klamath Basin stakeholders are in an endless cycle of conflict and litigation in which no one wins. Some argue that tensions could be alleviated by reducing the amount of water kept in the river for Endangered Species Act purposes. It's important to note that under the Klamath Coho biological opinion, coho salmon have received minimum flows necessary to support basic ecological function and prevent the spread of C. shasta, a lethal fish disease. The river has experienced minimum flows for over 675 days and did not receive any flows to prevent C. shasta in the last year. This flow regime is the equivalent of keeping the river on life support for over 675 days. No living system, including the mighty Klamath, can recover or thrive on life support. And what's worse, however, is if these flows were reduced any further, the Klamath River would be under threat of ecological collapse. It would set the stage for a repeat of the 2002 Klamath River fish kill, the largest fish kill in American history. But there is hope on the horizon. And Congressman Bentz, I want to assure you that the Klamath Basin is one ecosystem, and those dependent upon it are one people. The Klamath Basin will be able to better provide for its people when it's healthy. A healthy ecosystem is more productive, more drought resilient, and more able to adapt to new conditions caused by climate change. The Klamath Basin ecosystem must be restored. And the good news is that there are significant opportunities before us to restore the Klamath. First, dam removal. Klamath River dams are slated to be removed soon, and although that alone will not restore the basin, it will help immensely because it offers tremendous ecological benefits throughout the basin. And I direct committee members to my written testimony for more information there. Second, bill funding. Projects should be coordinated to provide basin-wide landscape scale restoration. The funding in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife budget should be leveraged with funding in other departments to maximize basin-wide benefits. The federal government should create an interagency work group to coordinate proposals in the projects. for projects in the basin, and also coordinate with co-managers in the basin to maximize basin-wide restoration benefits. And third, the hard truth is that no amount of restoration replaces the need for some amount of water in a river. Yurok's water rights are the largest unquantified water right in the basin. Satisfying the tribe's water rights will secure a more ecologically beneficial in-stream flow regime for overall ecosystem health, not just a single species like what is provided under the ESA. As we move forward, we must embrace these opportunities to set the future for the next 100 years in the basin. We must ask ourselves what is sustainable and let go of what no longer serves us. We must focus on our commonalities. And our commonality is that we are all dependent upon the basin's overall health. People in the basin cannot thrive until the ecosystem is restored. At Yurok, our culture imbues us with the responsibility of stewardship, and we will work with anyone who is like-minded to fulfill that responsibility. Thank you, Waklau.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cordalis. We will next hear testimony from Chairman Joe Davis of the Hoopla Valley Tribe. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Huffman and honorable members of the subcommittee. Chairman Joe Davis here, Hoopla Valley Tribe. We've been on the largest tributary to the Klamath River for well over 500 generations now, since time immemorial. We have the most senior water rights within the basin, shared with Yurok and other tribes. Just like to share with you today that our biggest concern is that the letter of the law be followed. There were a lot of laws put into place that protected the tribal rights and the tribal fishery and water quality, as well as restoration. Those things were derived from the 1955 Act that created the Trinity River Division of the Central Valley Project. Later on, the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. Also the 2000 Record of Decision, among others. Many of our tribal members, past leaders from the Hoopla Valley Tribe, have literally poured their blood, sweat, and tears into making sure that these laws were enacted. To this day, those laws continue to be ignored by the Bureau of Reclamation on many levels. There's $340 million of unaccounted for funds that were meant to be paid for by Central Valley water contractors. Under the previous administration, that money due for restoration was never collected. What's further is former Secretary of the Interior, Mr. David Bernhardt, he had written a memo that had stated that all restoration work on the Trinity River has been complete, and to this date that memo has never been officially rescinded. So we would like to see that memo officially rescinded and removed, and also that the Central Valley water contractors pay their fair share for restoration. Also, within the 1955 Act, there was a 50,000 acre feet of water that was set aside for the Trinity River for Humboldt County and downstream users, including the Hoopla and Yurok tribes. And that to date, none of that water has ever been realized by anybody. And there was a solicitor's opinion which verified that water was still due to the people here. And so that'll be extremely important. We ask that those laws be recognized, that they be adhered to, and they be respected. Getting back to our ancestors here, for our ability to protect these lands and these our way of life here, a lot of people literally gave their life. We can't forget the sacrifices that were made by our people, whether that was giving their life or sending their kids to boarding schools, also that we can continue on here and protect our way of life, our culture, our religion. All these things are dependent upon the river system, the fishery, And ultimately, it's for the people. And we really appreciate the time to be here today. We ask that we continue to work together and remember that, you know, the Hoopla Valley Tribe is a partner with Reclamation, with the Department of Interior to manage these resources. And we ask that we be treated as a partner going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll now hear testimony from Mr. Robert Super, Vice Chairman of the Yurok Tribe.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and the members of the committee. My name is Robert Super, and I'm a proud institution serving as Vice Chairman of the Yurok Tribe. Yurok Tribe is the second biggest tribe in California. We have 3,700 enrolled tribal members, and we have 5,300 enrolled descendants. Our office is in Happy Camp, California. We have offices in Orleans, and we have an office in Wairika. Our Aboriginal territory covers over 1 million acres along the mid-Klamath River, including large portions of Siskiyou County and Humboldt counties. The Yurok, today the Klamath Basin and the Yurok people are in crisis. The last 150 years, settlers in the Klamath Basin have dammed, diked, diverted, logged, and mined our sacred rivers of our Aboriginal area. Being Yurok means hunting, fishing, gathering basket materials, and actively acting as stewards to the landscape by using ceremonial fires. Today, the Klamath Basin ecological system is in a state of collapse. Already, chum salmon, pink salmon, and candlefish have been extirpated from the Klamath. Coho salmon, spring chinook, and suckerfish are close behind. Fall chinook runs are now dwindling to unfishable numbers. The severe decline of salmon also created problems for farmers and ranchers. When salmon population decreases, regulations burden the farmers and ranchers increases. For 2 decades, the Yurok Tribe, the Yurok Tribe, and the Klamath Tribe salmon fishermen, conservation groups, and other worked tirelessly to remove the 4 dams on the Klamath. Today, I'm proud to count Warren Buffett and his subsidiary Pacific Corp among allies to achieve the onerous goal. We are on track beginning dam removal process later this year. It should be noted that these dams provide no irrigation deliveries, no drinking water, and no flood control benefits. I will note that the dam removal is not funded by the United States. It's funded by California, Oregon, and Pacific Corp. I will also note that while the dam removal is necessary to restoring Klamath Basin fisheries, it's along no sufficient. It's why the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law could have come at more opportune time. While dam removal will allow salmon to assess hundreds of miles of historic habitat, dramatically improve water quality and remove conditions to allow fish disease-causing parasites to thrive. We will need to restore river reaches above the dams and key tributaries below the dams to make the most of the opportunity. A look at a greater landscape, achieve forest and watershed health is also critical. The Klamath River tributaries are vital to fish production in the Klamath. And I have 7 seconds left, so I really appreciate the time that you've given our tribe to be a part of this, and we are working with the people, the county, and them to help them with this effort.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. I will now yield to Ranking Member Bentz to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to introduce Tricia Hill, board member and former president of the Klamath Water Users Association, a fourth-generation Klamath Basin farmer. Tricia owns and operates her family farm, Gold Dust and Walker Farms, along with her father, uncle, and brother. Her degrees in law and environmental studies from the University of Oregon help her navigate the complex world of regulations, finance, and generational culture as her family and her farm and her community face the challenges presented by the Klamath. With that, I yield back to you, Mr. Chair, to let Ms. Hill go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Hill, welcome to the subcommittee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee for this hearing and allowing me the honor of testifying. I'm blessed to work every day with my family. And actually, I found out recently that I counted my generations wrong, and I'm actually proud to be a 5th-generation Klamath Basin farmer. I'm descendant of Czech immigrants that migrated from the chaos of Eastern Europe to establish a small town in Oregon called Malin. My personal history is made up of women farmers, and I had hoped my daughters would have the opportunity to follow in their footsteps. But that hope is fading day by day because of bad policy and single species management. Of course, we are mindful that we are latecomers into the area compared to the Native American tribes with whom we share the basin. There was a time our relationship with these neighbors was that of partnership and shared vision for strong, healthy communities, tribal and agricultural. Now we deal with each other cautiously instead of standing up for each other as we once did. And so in 2021, when no water was allocated to farmers or our refuges, no one outside our small community seemed to care. Winning has become the goal instead of actual success for species in our communities. As a member of the agricultural community, I will tell you, we feel targeted and devalued. We are struggling to explain to our children why raising food has become something to be ashamed of why the promise in the KSHA by federal, state, and tribal governments to address our agricultural community's needs has been forgotten. Once, I might have come before you and cited all the economic reasons there are to preserve our agricultural community. I might have asked, especially in the faces of the struggles in the Ukraine and skyrocketing grain prices, how is public policy served by destroying a community that grows food? But today I come before you not just as a father, but as a mother and a daughter. Due to the dewatering of the land in my part of the Klamath Basin, choking dust storms were a near constant last spring and early summer. My daughter is an asthmatic. My parents both have heart conditions that are greatly exacerbated by air quality issues. I come to you as a friend of my neighbors. Last year, hundreds of domestic wells went dry, including the well of a close family friend. She was 6 months pregnant with a 2-year-old at home and had no drinking water or a way to wash dishes. I come to you as a child of the basin. I grew up dancing under the sky, wide formations of geese and the evening love songs of frogs. With no water on our farms or in our canals, tens of thousands of acres of habitat were lost. Instead, our skies were empty and our nights silent. Last year, Lower Klamath Wildlife Refuge went dry again. This year, Tule Lake National Wildlife Refuge will join it, growing dry for the first time in its history. In short, under the current application of the ESA, there are no winners in the Klamath. And I cannot convey to you how heartbreaking it is to watch our basin, from its people to its wildlife, crumble around me. My community and the environment is being destroyed to no gain to anyone. We know fish populations and fish-based communities are hurting too, and we respect those communities and their real concerns. Commitments to dam removal and restoration funding signal to tribal communities and environmental groups that their voices are heard. As Ms. Cordalis mentioned in her testimony, for them, hope is on the horizon. Our irrigation communities need hope too. Today, we have none. Although we sincerely appreciate the funding directed to producers in the basin, this is not who we are. We are farmers. We grow things, children, crops, communities. The simple truth is that we need water to survive. A purpose of this hearing is to develop opportunities. By definition, opportunities are a situation or a set of circumstances that it makes possible to do something. So first, we must ask, what is that something? What is our goal? Once folks from the entire basin, upriver and downriver, agreed our primary goal were strong, stable communities so we could pass our traditions and our way of life to our children. For some communities, this meant fish in the river and the lake. For mine, it meant crops in the ground. But the point was that all communities, all people had value. If that is still the goal, first we must recognize the necessity of an allocation of water to the Klamath Project for basic human safety and community preservation, including water for irrigation and wildlife. If this need is not satisfied, we will soon cease to exist. This is the unfinished business of the KHSA. Second, we must acknowledge that the operations plan controlling the Klamath Project is completely dysfunctional. Micromanaging every single drop of water in the Klamath Basin is ridiculous. This lack of flexibility has created a failed system for listed species, farmers, and wildlife. Third, unless there's a broad-based joint planning process addressing all the goals and sub-goals submitted in my written testimony, priorities for funding must go to projects that help in getting the most out of water, such as storage and irrigation efficiency, or that target actual bottlenecks for protected species, concentrating on sucker recruitment versus spawning. Fourth, we must require accountability in our restoration efforts. Finally, we continue to believe that the long-term solutions for the Klamath lie in collaborative, basin-wide plan. As we say, the Klamath is complicated. It requires a hands-on, engaged federal leadership and a person who is the point for all federal agencies and stakeholders in order to move the ball. KWA supports Secretary Howland's identification of Elizabeth Klein to be that person. As a mother, a daughter, and a child of the Klamath, I hope that you and all stakeholders hear me when I say we in the Klamath Project still believe in a shared future where all communities are successful, period. We want to fight side by side with our neighbors to get there. We sincerely hope that everyone can return to a place where they stand with us as well. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry for going over.
No problem. Thank you, Ms. Hill. And the chair will now yield to Mr. Lamalfa to introduce our final witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. I have the opportunity and pleasure of introducing from Modoc County Supervisor Jerry Byrne. She chairs the Board of Supervisors way up there in that far right corner of California, as well as representing Voices Today here for the surrounding counties, Modoc and Siskiyou and Klamath County. So I appreciate her time on this and her hard work, and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and the chair welcomes Ms. Byrne to the subcommittee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
And thank you very much. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding this important hearing and for the honor of testifying before you today. I am Supervisor Jerry Byrne, and I'm speaking today on behalf of the 3 primary Klamath Basin counties, Klamath County, Oregon, Siskiyou County, California, and my own county, Modoc County in northeastern California. As the elected leaders of the Klamath Basin counties, we represent all of the citizens that we serve, and we have a clear legal responsibility to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens. We are the only level of government that has that responsibility. As of today, we face numerous overlapping crises, including the loss of basic drinking water to over 300 families and economic catastrophe due to the loss of irrigation water in our canals for our farms, not to mention the impacts to fish and wildlife at our neighboring federal wildlife refuges. To successfully carry out the health and safety mandate each of our counties depends upon the federal government to honor its federally mandated coordination obligation by conducting government-to-government interaction with county officials. While the Department of the Interior has recently conducted informational briefings focusing on the newly enacted infrastructure law, county leaders are seeking government-to-government coordination focused on our legal obligations, jointly held goals, and our sharing of proposed actions to fulfill these responsibilities. Today's crises stem from decisions made in 2021 when the Bureau determined that the project would receive a zero water allocation for wildlife refuges and project agriculture. This action directly resulted in the failure of more than 300 domestic wells in Klamath County alone, and is likely up to double that number when California's dry wells are also included. Consequently, these families are continuing to be left without water for drinking, cooking, or basic sanitation. While drought conditions will always be difficult to manage, cutting off water supply entirely to the Klamath Basin can never be an acceptable solution. We need a lifeline, and our constituents cannot sustain our economy without water. In Modoc County, the project is the primary economic driver for both the public and private sector. Revenues from this portion of the county are a significant part of our very small general fund budget, which without makes it difficult to provide core public safety, health, and human services for our county as a whole. Our entire community is suffering under the current operations plan. Our tribal partners and constituents, our agriculture community, our business community, and all of those that call the Klamath Basin home need our help. Importantly, this includes the more than 400 species of wildlife that depend on the water in the canals, the drainage, and the refuge habitat for survival, and we are all stewards in this effort. The goals of restoring fish and wildlife populations and delivering water to farmers are not mutually exclusive. Neither of these goals is being accomplished under the current operations plan. I am pleased to report to the committee that we've made some inroads in recent months in working with the Bureau and the Fish and Wildlife Service to begin government-to-government discussions. We look forward to continuing this consultation with these federal agencies to work together to find solutions to achieve mutual objectives and goals, and how best to incorporate the important perspectives of county government into the decision-making process. Currently, a prudent, conservative approach to rewater the system is being undertaken to ensure structural integrity of the canals. This current effort will enable bringing more water through the canals to both farmers and wildlife later in this year. We appreciate the need for ongoing coordination to satisfy the many competing concerns of our basin. As we discuss proposals for new infrastructure funding with the federal agencies, we will emphasize the importance of using these funds to the best effect and in a coordinated effort. Funds should be used with clear objectives in mind and measurable benefits that can be achieved. All too often in the past, we have seen what some call random acts of conservation, which have limited benefits, but often are not coordinated with other agencies' efforts or done in concert with local government's planning and input. Instead, we ask that federal agencies incorporate county elected officials' proposals and feedback to understand the socioeconomic impacts and consequences of federal decisions. We ask Congress to support efforts that are now underway to replenish the dry wells across the basin, to begin to restore the aquifer that is the lifeblood for our constituents, as well as replenish the wildlife refuge that is a vital part of our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Byrne. We'll now bring it back to the members of the committee for questions, and I'll begin by recognizing myself. Ms. Cordalis, not to take anything away from the hardships experienced by the communities that were described by Ms. Hill, but I believe in your written testimony you talked about the lack of running water and even electricity for many people on the reservation downstream. Again, I don't want to diminish the very real suffering that folks have had upstream during the worst years of this drought, but could you just remind us what these conditions have been like year in and year out on the Yurok Reservation?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the eloquent question there. I think it's safe to say that no community in the basin is thriving. At Yurok, the year after year drought conditions have stressed our water supplies. a lot of the reservation, I would say the majority of it, still doesn't have running water or even electricity. By way of example, our elementary school at the top part of the river or the reservation just got electricity about a year ago, the last school in California to have electricity. And what happens with drought is that our, the streams dry up. And when that happens, a lot of like disease, E. coli, that kind of thing gets into the streams, and that causes health problems for the people because they're taking water from the streams essentially. In addition to that, the other big impact, of course, of the drought has been annual baby fish kills. You see Shasta is killing the baby fish, and that's in part caused by lack of sufficient flows to flush out the worms that essentially spread that disease. Dams also contribute to that, but when we don't have the water, those little worms are able to just spread everywhere. And so the
I
result
want to come
of
back to
that
that,
is,
but
yeah,
first, if I could, I wanted to talk about the federal government's trust responsibilities to the Yurok and other tribes, including an obligation to safeguard and protect your treaty rights, fishing rights, and water rights. This is something that predates the Klamath project. It predates the hydropower dams. Why is it important for these rights to be quantified and legally secured, both for your tribe and for the basin as a whole? And what can the Interior Department do to support satisfaction of those rights?
Thank you, Chairman. Through the creation of the reservation, there was a trust responsibility that was established for the federal government to essentially be the caretaker and act in the best interest of Yurok rights. In addition to that, we also have federally reserved fishing, water rights, hunting rights. And specifically, our water rights have not yet been quantified, even though they are one of the most senior rights in the basin. And this, the lack of the water right being quantified contributes to the overall discord, about water in the basin, because we keep fighting over who has what. Right? So quantifying our water right would help bring certainty to the entire basin, because the federal government would know what its obligations are to the tribe with respect to delivery releases from Upper Klamath Lake. And we would also understand the impacts of those rights on the irrigators. The only other thing I'll mention is that we've also had problems in securing flows for our boat dance. In 2020, the federal government denied us boat dance flows, and we weren't able to do the ceremony, and that's a violation of our First Amendment rights. If our water rights are quantified, then everybody understands what their requirements are and how it impacts others, and then we're able to move forward also with our ceremony and our fishing way of life. Thank you.
Appreciate that. In the time I have left, there was a rather dismissive reference to the Iron Gate fish hatchery earlier from one of my colleagues, I think characterizing the removal of that dam and that hatchery as insane or ludicrous. I can't remember the word. It actually is not so insane and ludicrous, is it? Because I think that hatchery was put there to mitigate for the loss of hundreds of miles of habitat. Am I correct about that? And
Absolutely. Yes,
removing the dams reopens that habitat, so you actually get a lot of salmon in return. Am I right about that?
You are absolutely right. And actually what will happen is that we are working on moving some of those operations to the Fall Creek Hatchery. And so the Fall Creek Hatchery will continue to operate as, helping to produce more salmon. But I also want to note that the goal is to restore the wild runs of salmon. Those wild runs are the strongest and the best salmon for all of us. And, by restoring the river, removing the dams, habitat restoration, water quality improvements, we are hopeful that we can end reliance on hatchery and move back towards wild runs.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll yield back and recognize Ranking Member Bentz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a note for the record, Ms. Cordalis suggested that there were 675 days where there was inadequate water looking back in the river, there seemed to be an implication there that the irrigators had something to do with it. I would just call out in 2020, the irrigators took a mere fraction of what they normally would have been entitled to under their right, and the rest of the water went down the river. And in 2021, the project took no water. All the water stayed in the lake for a while, then it went down the river. So I just want to call out and make the record clear that this lack of water in the last 2 years is not on the irrigators' back. So let me move now to Ms. Hill and ask a little bit more about the impact of having no water. And last year, Ms. Hill, as I understand it, the Water Resources Department allowed an additional 2 acre-feet of water to be withdrawn on an emergency basis from groundwater resources. And that resulted in a depletion, if you will, of your groundwater. And that in turn has led to wells drying up because they're not being replenished by virtue of water being put through the irrigation system, the project system. Do I have that right?
Yes, so most of the ground where we live is old lake beds, so it's very permeable, and most house wells are fairly shallow because they didn't need to go very deep to be able to hit the water table from those old lake beds. And then that water was replenished through agriculture, whether it was applying water through sprinklers or through flood irrigating, and that's kind of how the cycle of water primarily works in the project. Because of the severe lack of water, both in 20 and then no water in 21, there was no water either coming from the surface down or within those canals to sub out. And so we have seen more and more domestic wells go dry. For example, my well is not dry, but last summer.
Forgive me, Ms. Hill, but I'm going to interrupt because I have to ask you more questions and I don't have much time.
Sorry.
So my understanding is that the groundwater table has dropped by 10 feet. Much of the water that was relied upon in the last year to try to bail people out is now gone. And therefore, the Water Resource Department has now said no more emergency use of water. That means that the situation in the basin for those who were trying to use a little groundwater to help is now not, that water's not available. What's going to happen to the farmers when they don't have groundwater to fall back on if no water comes out of the river?
We're going to lose more farmers. We lost some last year. We'll continue to see our community matriculate. And my daughters will come home and explain to me that close friends of theirs are leaving the basin because they no longer have work in ag.
Your property used to be worth between around $5,000 an acre. My understanding is that value without water is what?
$3,500.
That is much higher than what I have heard. I've heard people would be lucky without water to get something in the neighborhood of $1,000 an acre.
Yeah, there's absolutely. Sorry.
Please go ahead,
Congressman. So it depends on the location. If you're talking about ground that has well-supported rights, you're looking at $2,800. If you're talking about ground that has good farm ground that has absolutely no rights, you're looking at between $1,000 and $1,800.
Correct. And since your groundwater resource has been depleted and is gone, it won't be pointing at a well does not do any good. Let's move to what happens to that land once the farmers leave. What's going to happen to it?
Well, there's not going, because there's not the ability to drill a house well, there's really no use for that ground. You're going to see more absentee landowners, more noxious weeds, and unfortunately more dust storms.
And your community is going to shrink as more and more people pick up and leave. And so this cost is odd given the fact that the government originally encouraged people to move out there and take up this land based upon the availability of water provided by the Bureau of Reclamation. My understanding is that maybe one of the so-called long-term solutions should be the Bureau of Reclamation looking into how it's going to reverse this process now that people are being forced off the land. Is that something you're interested in pursuing?
Yes, for the project to survive, we have to have an allocation of water each year. Zero is just simply not an option for my community.
Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Benz. The chair now recognizes Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Cordelis, can you speak more to the impact of the record-breaking drought affecting the Yukon's drinking water supply and the tribal fisheries? And what are the long-term solutions the tribe has identified, and how can recent investments in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law help support solutions? Do you have support for the tribes to access information for filing grants?
Thank you, Ms. Napolitano, for the question. So essentially, the drought means that we don't have sufficient water on the Yurok reservation. My community is already in economic crisis. The annual income on the reservation is about $11,000. The tribal government is trying very hard to build its own economy, but the lack of a reliable water supply makes that almost impossible. By way of example, right at the mouth of the river in the town of Klamath, we have our tribal office, and there we don't have a sufficient water supply to expand the building or expand into other areas for economic development. So our hands are essentially tied. We acknowledge that we have to work with the basin. Again, I'll stress that we are one basin and one people, united in this crisis. And for us, the plan forward is to remove the dams, use the bill funding for basin-wide restoration. And I mean it when I say I think it's incredibly important that the federal government work with stakeholders to combine the ecological benefits of the projects funded through bill funding to make sure that we get to overall ecosystem-wide restoration, because that's going to help all of our communities withstand drought, for example, right? So we've got to do that. The other thing I'm hearing a lot about from all the members is the tensions between Oregon and California. I think there's a need for an amendment to the Klamath Compact to require a delivery amount from Oregon into California, which would help resolve some of those interstate issues. I mean, essentially what we need to do is to sort of give the Klamath a facelift or an update, right? And we've got all this in front of us to do that. But what is critical is that everybody has to know what their rights are. We have to bring equity to the basin. Then we have to resolve these longstanding legal issues, and we're not going to get there through litigation. And so we need, DOI's leadership, the state's leadership, your leadership throughout this whole committee to help us come together to identify those big legal issues and solutions to those problems to sort of get us out of this. Thank you.
My understanding for a long time has been that the Native Americans have first water rights in the U.S. So why are those not being honored?
Because the federal government has never backed them. They have never put the kind of oomph and the support of the federal government behind them.
Then have you filed against the government?
We have filed against the government in every way we can. And I am happy to say that we are working in partnership with the federal government now with this administration to try to assert our water right, but it's going to take a lot. So we need leadership.
Well, how about the tribes' access to be able to get the funding to move ahead with the plans?
Thank you. So we understand that the bill funding is going to come out in 5 years. In this first year, one of the things that we need is to have some capacity development funds, planning, development, that kind of thing, so that we have the capacity to apply for grants, large scale grants, right, in years 2 through 5.
Well, I understand it's a rough thing to consider. The farmers need to raise crops to put food on the table, but also you need them for your tribe to survive, literally to live. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. And I'll also remind everyone that fishermen feed America as well, right? And so that's why it's not one versus the other. We are united, right? And we've got to restore the basin's overall ecosystem health in order to allow it to better support all of us.
Well, I know that there's a lot of people against getting those dams down, but it means life to your tribes.
It means life to our tribes. And one of the things it'll do is it'll help eliminate or significantly reduce sea Shasta. It also improves water quality. And it will reunite the basin. We miss the Klamath tribes. We wish the Klamath tribes were here at this hearing, because what they would tell you is that they want fish to come home to the upper basin. And so removing those dams is going to allow those fish to come home, and it will help to, restore their treaty rights and allow them to exercise that ancient fishing right. We look forward to that day.
Well, you keep plugging away. Mr. Chairman,
Thank you.
I return to you.
Thank you, Mr. Politano. The chair recognizes Mr. McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Supervisor Byrne, isn't about $250 million that's being used to tear down these dams coming from a water bond that was passed by California voters on the promise that that was going to be used to finance new water projects, not destroy existing water projects?
Thank you, Congressman McClintock. Yes, that's my understanding. We have had all the water bonds we've passed, we've had no water storage projects built in this, either of the states to help.
So these leftists are simply liars. Now, the Klamath Dams generate about 155 megawatts of the cleanest and cheapest electricity that we're capable of producing. I'm told that's enough for a population of about 155,000 people. How's that electricity going to be replaced?
We don't have that answer at this point. It would be a good question to ask.
I don't hear the tribes offering to regenerate. What we do hear is, oh, don't worry, we'll just replace it with wind and solar. But doesn't wind and solar require like amounts of reliable backup power, which is exactly what the hydroelectric dams supply?
Sure. We need a base power that works all the time, not just if the sun's shining or the wind's blowing.
Yeah, and what they're doing is they're tearing down the dams that create the base power to support wind and solar, and then tell us, don't worry, we'll just replace it with more wind and solar. And isn't the cost for wind and solar much higher than these hydro plants?
That's my understanding.
And who pays the difference?
The users.
Meaning the ratepayers.
Yes, the ratepayers, our constituents.
Now, the chairman says, don't worry about losing the Iron Gate fish hatchery. Tearing down the dams means we'll just replace the hatchery with wild salmon runs. Has anyone remotely suggested that the wild salmon runs will replace the 5 million salmon smolts we hatch right now at Iron Gate?
That's really not my area of expertise, but I have not heard anything.
No, I haven't either. Tell me, what is agricultural water? Isn't that the water that we consume when we buy basic products like food? I've seen estimates, for example, when we buy a cheeseburger, we just consume 750 gallons of water because that's what it takes to grow the stuff in that cheeseburger. If you buy a pair of jeans, you've just consumed about 1,500 gallons of water because that's what it takes to grow the cotton in those jeans. So how are we going to replace that water?
We can't feed and clothe America or do anything without water. It's important.
In fact, I think it's a universal truth that everything around us, look around the room you're in right now, everything in it, everything that makes our lives easier, in fact, everything that makes our survival possible, everything comes from either two sources. It is either grown or it is mined. I don't think there are any exceptions. So we either grow them or we mine them. Yet what has the left devoted its entire environmental agenda toward? Shutting down our ability to grow things and mine things, all the things that we depend upon to survive and to thrive and to prosper. And with respect to agriculture, if we can't grow it, we can't eat it, we can't grow it without water. Is this what you'd call complete insanity?
I would agree with that statement.
Thank you. Well, I think I'll just yield my remaining time to Mr. Lamalfa if he's available.
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. Supervisor Byrne, let me continue here a little bit. When we're talking about the effects, put it in like just plain people terms on what it means when the water has run out in these communities to people's basic water supply. What is the crisis the counties, I guess, are put crisis in plain terms?
Okay, so we believe this drought crisis is analogous to a fighting a wildfire. The health and safety of those laying in the path of fighting a fire overrides business as usual management plans. And due to the historic drought and subsequent federal government management decisions, hundreds of our county's residents, many of whom are disadvantaged, low income and or minority systems, are without basic necessities for safe and healthy living in their own homes.
Now, when earlier on, when there was, all the KBRA discussion there, it was a kumbaya. Was there coordination amongst the counties and all the other interests at the table on KBRA? What kind of coordination is there having these conversations about the different needs for the water supply?
So back during the KBRA, I know MODOC was not involved, Siskiyou was not involved, I think Klamath was, but it's important that the counties be at the table when we do these things early before the things are done, because we have information that maybe they don't have at the federal level. We're the closest to the people, and we know, what possible solutions are and what the problems are with anything.
Was there people that wanted to be at the table or disinvited?
Mr. Lamalfa's time has expired. I thank the witness. And again, to keep things factual, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record Proposition 1, the California Water Bond of 2014, which explicitly included $250 million for dam removal. That's part of how it passed with the California voters. That's part of how we got that funding approved by the people of California. So instead of histrionics and calling people liars, we do need to consult the facts from time to time. With that, the chair recognizes Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all the panelists on the witnesses on the second panel, Ms. Cordalis, Mr. Davis, Mr. Super, Ms. Hill, and Ms. Byrne. My question is for the Vice Chair, Robert Super of the Yurok Tribe. Vice Chair Super, a 2019 UN report found that the expansion of human infrastructure, including hydroelectric dams, has led to habitat fragmentation and biodiversity loss worldwide. This is one of the multiple factors pushing roughly 1 million animal and plant species around the globe towards extinction. Now, with the upcoming removal of the 4 dams on the lower Klamath River, there's a chance to take a step towards species recovery. I'm interested to hear more about the Yurok tribe's perspective on the significant harm these dams have had on ecosystems and fish and wildlife, and the opportunities that come from removing the dams. First question then would be, what impact have these dams had since their construction? Was your tribe consulted about the building of these 4 dams on the lower Klamath in the first place? Mr. Super.
No, we weren't. We are working on right now putting fire to the land. Because of the fires that we've had in and around Happy Camp, culturally, we used to burn, and so we wouldn't have catastrophic fires. And also we could have more snowpack for the snow to be for the water that we need for our salmon. And so that's what our tribe's doing right now.
And what can you describe in maybe a little bit more detail the benefits that the Yurok tribe anticipates once the dams are removed?
Once the dams were removed, we feel that the salmon will go back to their natural habitats and do the spawning and rearing like they have done in the past. fish kill that Amy was referring to, the year after that, or 4 years after that, that's when we were expecting the salmon to come back. That would have been in that round. And so our tribe and the tribal council decided to not fish, only fish for ceremonial use that year, so we could let the salmon go up and to grow other salmon. So we only use for subsidy.
And how could additional federal funding, including significant investments from the recent Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, help your community maximize the benefits of dam removal over the long haul?
We have been working with the Yuroks and some of the farmers up in the Scott and Shasta Valley, and we are talking about putting in, seeing what we have to do to bring the salmon back, to bring to set up beaver dams, well, made beaver dams in Dillon Creek, Beaver Creek, Shasta, Scott River, Dillon Creek, so that we could bring our salmon back to some of the other places. And like I said, above the dams, they had natural habitats too that we're going to be working on, seeing what we can do to help that up there too.
Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. Is Mr. Graves with us? I believe he was next in the batting order. And all right, since Mr. Graves is not with us, Mr. Lamalfa, you're up for 5 minutes.
Thanks again, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak with Ms. Hill about it. So what do you have top of your head the storage capacity of the Upper Klamath Lake? I have it as 562,000 acre feet. How much of that capacity was augmented by establishment of the Klamath Project in the early 1900s? How many more acre feet did that add to the?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Lamalfa, I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I think it's 300,000 plus that the additional height of that dam. Are you familiar very much with the act on a portion called Section 8, that it was indeed put in place to prevent interference with state water laws as BOR observes in California when we're talking about the allocation of water that's going out the Delta? Is Section 8 of the act also supposed to be not interfering with Oregon state water law?
And I'm sorry, Mr. Lamalfa,
That's okay.
Also.
Okay, tell me, are you familiar, what is a typical water temperature in Upper Lake, especially as we get into the summer months? I have it as about, go ahead.
To say high 70s, 80s.
The water temp is in the 70s or even 80s in the lake, not the river. So this is the water we want to introduce year-round downstream that is going to supposedly help sustain the salmon population in the river, or the suckerfish when the wet lake is kept at high levels.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's the water that we have to send downriver. Okay.
Do you have any information on the suckerfish and its sustainability at deep water? Because, you know, when we're looking at all the science and all the information out there, there's a certain amount of science saying that deep water levels are actually detrimental holding the water deep in the lake year round, that it actually makes the sucker population more subject to predators and other ill effects.
My understanding is there is a report that will be coming out from USGS this summer discussing that issue, as well as the phosphorus levels in the lake. Of course, our large concern is that the springtime lake levels are held high for the purpose of spawning for the suckerfish. However, only 10% of the suckerfish actually spawn in the lake, and 0% of fish are recruited. So essentially, we forego irrigation in the spring to get 10%, 0% of 10% of fish.
0% or 10% is the yield for no irrigation in spring.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Let me throw a couple questions quick to the representatives from the three tribes here, Ms. Cordalis, Mr. Davis, Ms. Super. As we see in the situation in 2021, agriculture received 0 from the lake, okay? And the refuges have suffered tremendously on that as well. Do you see the permanent solution, since all the water is being allocated to the river, whether it's for a sea Shasta flush or for salmon or a boat dance or other things, that that there's going to be any agriculture left in the basin?
Well, Congressman Lamalfa, Joe Davis here, Hoopla Tribe. I mean, you know, for us, we always hold out hope. You know, we know that climate change is bearing down on us, but we have hope for greater supplies of water going into the future. What I would note is that, you know, there's no threat or danger to agriculture going totally extinct at this time. You know, with fisheries and our fish and water rights, and particular our fishery and what it means to our people, you know, we've enjoyed the benefits of that since time immemorial. You know, once our fish go extinct, however, that way of life and our culture and our identity is gone. And you know, we've already lost so much. You know, we here on the Hoopla Valley Indian Reservation, we're the largest reservation in California by land, and yet we occupy less than half of our original Aboriginal territory. So we've given up probably 2/3 of our original land base, and so we've also lost our language, we lost our culture, we lost so many things in our way of life and being able to
I'm
live
sorry,
on
Mr. Chairman, I have to shift,
so,
but that,
so you know,
thank
we've
you.
already given up a lot. We don't want to lose any more. Thank you.
But that's not due to 100 years of agriculture in the valley. And indeed, you could say agriculture in 2021 was extinct for that year. The other two would, Ms. Cordalis.
Yeah,
okay, time's up.
If the other witnesses want to speak very briefly, just in a few seconds.
Thank you.
I'll just make one quick comment. I just would remind the committee members that last year we did not receive any fish disease flows at all. So nobody won last year because there wasn't enough water for anybody to win. Everybody lost.
All right. And Mr. Super, did you want to offer a quick response?
Yes, I'd like to say too that last year that the water was low in our fishery area. When the water's low, it's really hard for our fishermen to catch the salmon, because the salmon go right up the middle, and they don't stop to rest. And so we had a bad year of fishing this last year.
All right, thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair recognizes Ms. Stansbury for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. It's wonderful to see a number of old friends, especially you, Ms. Cordalis, and our tribal leaders. We really appreciate you for being here today, and also our civil servants who testified in the first part of this hearing. And, you know, many of you know I've worked in water for many years. I actually worked on the Klamath Basin agreements in the Senate as a water staffer in the Senate Energy Committee. And I also worked on them at OMB when we were looking for funding to implement all of the different portions of those agreements and many of the issues that we're talking about here today. And so I have to say, having worked on these issues myself for more than a decade and hearing some of the comments and commentaries that I've heard today, I've been a little shocked and dismayed by the ways in which these agreements and the ways in which this conservation effort and the repatriation and decommissioning of these dams have been discussed, because this is based on literally decades of science consultation with our tribal leaders. It's based on the historic and traditional knowledge of our tribal communities on fisheries science, on water resources management and law and precedent. And I think that the work that all of you have done for decades and for generations to restore this watershed, to bring back the salmon to this watershed, to work with the utilities to decommission these dams, and to bring the fish back is so crucial, especially at this moment as we're facing climate change and our communities, as we're hearing today, are struggling with a drought that really is the signature of climate change, and we are going to have to learn to live with in the coming generations. And so as we look to agreements like those that have been put together in the Klamath Basin, it's fascinating to hear some of the conversation today, because nationally, the Klamath Basin agreements that bring everyone to the table are really a national model for how do you bring stakeholders together to talk about their future, to look at the science, to identify what the priorities are, and then to ensure that our farmers do have a future, that our tribal rights and our treaty rights and the federal government's responsibilities to the tribes are met, and that we're able to actually administer water in a way that makes sense, not only for the people living there, but also for the restoration and well-being of the fish and plants and animals that live there. And I've worked, as I said, on these issues for many years. I think the Klamath is an excellent example of what can be done when you take an olive watershed approach. There are other basins where this has been done, like the Yakima Basin in Washington State, which I had the tremendous honor of working on for Senator Cantwell when I worked in the Senate, and many of the other basins that we're looking at across the country to do this kind of collaborative work and really bring a new paradigm approach to how we address these issues. And I would like to just say that in New Mexico, we are looking to places like the Klamath and the Yakima for our own model in the Rio Grande, where we can bring our tribal leaders to the table, where we can bring our historic farming communities together, we can bring together our municipalities and the conservationists and environmentalists who also care about these issues to craft solutions that are durable, that make sense, that take the watershed scale into consideration, that honor tribal rights, and that will ultimately be based on the best available science, as is the case in the Klamath Basin. So to that end, I just wanted to take a moment to ask some of our witnesses who have been literally working on this their entire lifetimes to talk a little bit about what is needed at this particular moment. I noted, Ms. Cordalis, in your testimony, you say in your testimony, hope is on the horizon, but federal leadership is really needed at this moment. And so what does that look like? What can we here in Congress do? And how can we help empower the federal agencies to be better partners with the tribes and communities on the ground?
Thank you, Representative Stansbury, and it is fantastic to see you in this role. And I know you will serve our country and your district well here. So what do we need? We need to continue to have basin-wide dialogue. I've always appreciated Congressman Bentz's comments about having a plan. We at this point don't have the plan, but we sort of have the framework for it. And what I tried to lay out in my testimony is that we need dam removal, we need this bill funding, restoration work, infrastructure work to be funded through that bill funding. And then we need to have a really hard conversation about water allocation as between the two states and also as between the different user groups. And that's where I think we need federal leadership over all of that to, one, make sure that the dams come out in a timely manner, two, to make sure that the bill funding projects are done in a way that offers basin-wide restoration benefits, but then three, really helps guide this discussion towards a more equitable, a more peaceful, a more sustainable future. So strong federal leadership and not being afraid to make a change.
Thank you so much. And I think obviously I'm out of time here, but you know, I often like to think about these watershed-wide efforts as marriages. They wax and wane. Sometimes there's tough times. Sometimes it's obvious there's a path forward and things are good. And I think in some ways the Klamath really embodies that. You know, we have to live in these watersheds and we have to live within the means that our Creator provides us with in those watersheds and do our best to be good stewards for the land and to be good neighbors to each other. And I think that that is really what we're trying to achieve in this basin. I know it's scary and it's hard, and this drought is creating conditions that are obviously creating immense hardship. But I have every amount and ounce of optimism and hope that there's a path forward, and just know that I'm here to be a partner for all of you in your journey on that path. So thank you.
Thank you,
Mr.
Ms.
Chairman.
Stansberry. I certainly allowed a little extra time there because I wanted to see where this marriage metaphor was going, and you ended us on a hopeful note, and so I think that is an appropriate place to stop. I want to thank all of the witnesses for their valuable testimony. I want to thank the members for their thoughtful questions. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for witnesses, and we'll ask them to respond to those
Mr. Chair,
in writing.
before we adjourn,
I'm sorry.
I'd
Mr.
like to
McClintock, yes?
Yeah, I think I'd like to ask unanimous consent that we also include in the record the ballot arguments submitted to California voters for the ballot proposition that promises reliable water supply for farms and businesses during the severe drought, but mentions nothing about removing the dams on the Klamath.
That's fine. We can have the ballot measure itself, which does explicitly include that funding, and the ballot arguments as well. Happy to enter those into the record without
Mr. Chairman?
objection. Yes.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Can I have
Mrs.
5
Gonzalez
minutes
Colon.
still available to yield my time to Representative Lamalfa or ranking member?
I mean, Ms. Gonzalez Colon, we had completed this panel. If the ranking member needs more time, I'm happy to give it to him. We've heard from everyone else. I think we need to move on.
I will yield to the ranking member then.
And I don't believe the ranking member is here. So we're going to wrap up.
Mr. Chairman,
We're going to wrap up. Mr. Lamalfa, you have made good use of your drop-in privileges today. Members of the committee will submit written questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for their response.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Mr. Chairman, then I would like to yield my time to Representative Lamalfa.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon, we've already completed the panel, and I had moved to close the hearing. So we're going to do that. If there's no further business, then without objection, we stand adjourned.